Alright, YouTube, in the description you'll find an article on CNN that was written by a blogger named David Frum. David Frum seems to be a GOP establishment supporter, you know, the typical neoconservative. And he wrote an opinion article on CNN today dealing with Ron Paul. And I'm going to tear his argument apart based on some statements that he made and some points that I'd like to make about neoconservatism, libertarianism, etc. Now, the basic gist of the article, and I'll go through some quotes here, and it's obvious that he hates Ron Paul for his own neoconservative reasons. It's fair to say that almost, and this references supposedly racist newsletters that went out back in the 90s in Ron Paul's name. Now, this is a 20-year-old issue, so, you know, you can look at it that way as it's old news, but it is a legitimate concern. It's fair to say that almost no one who has followed the controversy believes that Paul is telling the truth about any of this. The authorship of the newsletters is an open secret in the libertarian world. Actually, it's not really an open secret, it's simply open. Nobody was trying to keep these newsletters covered up. It's just that until Ron Paul became big in the polls, the neoconservatives weren't that afraid. The neoconservatives and the left-wingers are absolutely terrified of Paul because he's the only candidate right now with any integrity that's actually preached the same message since inception in the political process. The neoconservatives hate him because he's not kissing the ass of Israel, and because he's not kissing the ass of corporations, which all mainstream Republicans love to do. The left is terrified because they know that a candidate who can organize the youth vote better than Obama ever did could potentially win the election. The racism of the newsletters and the elaborate lying subsequently deployed to evade responsibility for the newsletters say much about the ethics of Paul himself and the circle around him. What elaborate lying? He has already addressed these newsletters many times in the past on his website. Other people working with him have addressed them as well. I fail to see why Ron Paul would continue to address an issue that he's already explained adequately before. The idea of CNN saying that he stormed off the set after the interview when he was asked about them, that he went crazy and berserk and that he was out of control and marched off the set angrily. All he did was calmly remove his microphone and leave the room. He's already addressed the issue. He's already stated that he didn't author them, and it's well known, and here's another fact, we know who authored the articles. We know that Ron Paul probably did not read them when they were going out. I fail to see why this is an issue, and here's the other thing. These establishment GOP people are so concerned about the supposed anti-Semitism of Ron Paul. He's a bigot, he's an anti-Semite, oh my God, all these terrible things. The GOP for the last 50 years has been discriminating against and supporting discrimination against gay people. It's been discriminating against and supporting discrimination against alternative religious groups, Muslims included. Not the Jews, obviously, because they're all kissing Israel's ass. But certainly against Muslims, certainly against, for instance, Wiccans and so forth, Hindus. Enforcing racial stereotypes, the Republican Party loves these things. Rick Santorum and Herman Cain and Michelle Bachmann have all made terribly bigoted statements against gays. Rick Perry as well. They are bigots. So Ron Paul comes out, he's never said anything bigoted towards the gay community. He's never said, as far as I know, anything bigoted about Israel or the Israelis or the Jews in general. And yet the mainstream GOP is coming out and calling him a bigot for things which were written 20 years ago which he disavowed. I fail to see how anyone can possibly look at the way in which this is playing out and say that anyone is being honest about what Ron Paul said. The GOP is bigoted. They're bigoted towards gays all the time. You never hear anybody whining and complaining about that. But as soon as a libertarian emerges on the set, the GOP establishment went absolutely crazy. Ron Paul is still leading in Iowa. and he's a strong second in New Hampshire, and he's creeping up. He's going to end up displacing Newt Gingrich and probably taking a strong second in New Hampshire. He's probably going to win Iowa with a few days left till the caucuses. I fail to see, and you look at the poll numbers, he's still increasing in popularity. If this is such a huge issue, why aren't his poll numbers decreasing? Frum is obviously just another Zionist supporter. And here's another thing he said. As I can attest firsthand, anyone who writes negatively about Paul will see his email inbox fill rapidly with anti-Semitic diatribes. Two things. First, I keep up on the news with Ron Paul. I work with some of his supporters. I've looked at their comments. I've never seen anyone say anything anti-Semitic on any Ron Paul support video anywhere on YouTube. I've never seen anything anti-Semitic from his supporters anywhere. I've seen them say that we should stop funding Israel. I've seen Ron Paul say we should stop funding Israel. That is not anti-Semitism. What that is a marked and good foreign policy that will allow Israel the independence to do its own thing and support itself, as all nations have a responsibility to do. If Ron Paul were saying we should stop funding Pakistan, the GOP would crow with approval, because them damn Muslims over there never helped us do anything, and they were hiding Osama bin Laden, and all the terrible things that the Muslims do. And if Ron Paul said we should stop funding abortion, the GOP would crow with approval, and they would say, oh, wonderful pro-lifer. And if he said we should stop funding any of a number of different things, farm subsidies or whatever, they'd all crow with approval because he's reducing spending. But if you say we should stop giving billions of dollars a year to the one nation the neoconservatives care about, and they don't care about the United States, they care about Israel, because they're convinced that the world's going to end and that anyone who gives Israel money, I guess, will go to heaven or something. Oh, well, that's a terrible person. And it's really extra sad that this article is being taken seriously and being posted on a major news internet site, because just the language of the article itself is clearly not journalistic in nature. The daffy old coot side of Ron Paul's personality is genuine enough. The crank side is certainly genuine, as are at least some of the racial views. Again, he's already addressed them, so we're not exactly sure what racial views he's talking about. Even after Paul abandoned the crude race-baiting of the 1990s newsletters, how could he abandon it if he didn't know about it happening? He continued to engage in elaborate apologetics for the Confederate side of the Civil War. Ron Paul's from the South. Haven't you seen Rick Perry and all of the other mainstream GOP candidates? They want to return to the Confederacy anyway. All of them do. They're all higher on states' rights than federal rights. Half of them are bigoted towards minority groups. I mean, a full half of them. We're talking Perry, Bachmann, Santorum. We're talking about Herman Cain. We're talking about these candidates. What I don't understand is why it's okay to be bigoted against gays, but if you're associated with a letter published 20 years ago that said one thing that was anti-Semitic, suddenly there's a huge problem. The fact is that the reason this is being focused on has absolutely nothing to do with any genuine concern about the articles. Most of the mainstream GOP would probably agree with the message. Not the anti-Semitic part, but the anti-black part, you can bet. The fact is that it's simply being used as a ploy by the establishment corporatist right-wingers that control the country currently, and by the establishment corporatist left-wingers which run the country currently, because there are no libertarians in power. You've got a handful of Tea Partiers which were kind of libertarian. Ron Paul's the only real libertarian there, so he's the bad guy that we've got to force out of the race, because it looks like he's going to displace good old Newt Gingrich. And lo and behold, the ultimate win for Ron Paul about this supposedly racist diatribe. The president of the NAACP came out and said he wasn't a racist. The president of the NAACP, a traditionally very liberal group, doesn't really like Republican candidates very much. We all know that. The NAACP is strictly liberal. comes out and says Ron Paul's not racist, and yet you still have this idiot blogger David Frum coming out, and you have a million other liberal and neoconservative bloggers and journalists coming out bashing Ron Paul because of racist newsletters. I just don't understand it. Ron Paul is the Max Baileystock of monetary cranks, I guess the idea being that he's just trying to make money off a candidacy. And this latest presidential campaign represents the summit of his bunco artist career, his very own springtime for Hitler. I just don't understand the reference and see where it fits in with Ron Paul. He's running a legitimate campaign, he's raised tens of millions of dollars, he's on top in the first caucus state, he's running a strong second in New Hampshire. And yet Ron Paul is crazy. Now you've got Rick Santorum coming out saying gays shouldn't be allowed to marry. Gays shouldn't be allowed to have kids. You got Michelle Bachmann coming out saying, well, gay people, you know, they're possessed by demons. She's literally alluding to that in her speeches. They're saying all of these things. And yet Ron Paul, who merely stated that we should stop funding Israel, is a loony old crank and an out-of-touch, grumpy old codger. I don't understand this. It just, when something doesn't make sense, it's usually because it's not true. And the attacks on Ron Paul focusing on 20-year-old newsletters and blaming him as a bigot in a campaign where half the candidates are clearly bigots themselves does not make sense. The reason these attacks are happening is because the establishment GOP, which runs off of big military, big corporate, big government control of social values, is terrified that a libertarian will get the nomination. It would destroy the military-industrial complex control over the political process. The left wing's terrified because they're terrified that Obama will get out of there and stop his programs. If Ron Paul became president, I'm not saying he would do a perfect job. I think he would do a good job as best he could. Depending on who ran the House and the Senate, he might get quite a bit accomplished. Not a perfect candidate. No candidate ever is. No human is. But it just doesn't make sense that finally we've got a libertarian candidate with mainstream support from a very large proportion of the population, and they're getting bashed for a newsletter published 20 years ago under their name but was never authored or signed off on by them. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, it's like the whole Swift voting thing all over again. It's the same damn thing. You've got other people putting words in a candidate's mouth and they're blaming the candidate. I'm assuming that Frum is just, I don't know, a disgruntled Newt Gingrich or Mitt Romney supporter, most likely Newt Gingrich, considering Mitt Romney would probably be too liberal for him. But, I mean, it's just sad. I mean, I've made a video before about how Ron Paul won a poll on Fox News. He won the poll by tens of thousands of votes. Lo and behold, they announced the results for Mitt Romney. Does that make sense to you? Fox News did its best to ignore Ron Paul and did virtually no news stories on him until about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Then all of a sudden they started covering him. Now, because he is no longer obscure, and because he is now a mainstream candidate, instead of ignoring Ron Paul, which obviously didn't work, the left-wing media and the establishment right-wing media are doing their best to cast him as the crazy spoiler, the grumpy old man, the dude who will never get elected but is interesting anyway, trying to simultaneously praise him as being this cute, open, gaping-mouthed old man who laughs funny, and simultaneously at the same time cast him as, well, he can't win. He can't get the nomination. He could never beat Obama. His views are extreme. You've got Michelle Bachmann coming out and saying that gay people need to repent to God of the demons inside of them. She said that. You've got Michelle Bachmann saying that. Nobody came out in Fox News and said she's unelectable, a bigot, or an extremist. And yet Ron Paul simply says we should stop funding the country that's causing war and terror all over the Middle East, and all of a sudden he's a bigot and he's unelectable. First he was the ignored candidate. Look at the famous Iowa straw poll. Michelle Bachmann wins, Tim Pawlenty gets third. Never mentioned Ron Paul. First they ignore you, and then they try to belittle you. He's probably going to win Iowa, and when he does, I'm going to laugh my ass off. If he goes on to win New Hampshire, I'm going to laugh twice as hard. But Ron Paul is not a bigot or an anti-Semite. If you want bigots, you go to Michelle Bachmann or Rick Perry or someone like that. Peace out.